Hey everybody, what's going on? This is wilkyb, and in this video I'm talking about the two elements that provide complexity to this game that is Advance Wars, which also applies to other games of a similar nature of Advance Wars. The two elements that I'm talking about here is min-maxing the development phase towards the center of the map, and then after that it's min-maxing the stalling phase, where you decide about how you want to engage with your opponent such that you don't activate their co-powers, where their counterattack will outvalue the original first strike that you commit to them. So, one thing I notice on every competitive full vision map is that there's only one or two build orders that players can commit to that doesn't put them at a disadvantage going into the stalling phase. So, that's not a lot of fun. I've been advocating against this for a long time, that if you apply Fog of War to a map, that you can develop it around the development phase where there's much more variety, because it provides Fog of War so you can't see what your opponent is doing. So on every competitive map, there's a naturally advantaged player. This is true on my maps as well. There's a naturally advantaged player versus the naturally disadvantaged player, and you're basically just obscuring who is, what is the solution to the map. And so what happens on a lot of map committee maps, maybe not a lot, but what's happened on this one here for sure, is that this map has been min-maxed. And what happens when you reach the highest echelons of the competitive ladder is that two players who are high rated will play into a map with the mirror match, because they both recognize at first that this is the strongest to go into this map to win. And then after about maybe 10 matches played between those two players on a mirror match, the map gets basically solved, and the naturally advantaged player, who is player one in this replay, J-Town, they pretty much automatically win because they do the most efficient development phase, and then they also maximize the stalling phase at the center of the map. And I think Law recognizes this, and so what happens is we reach about halfway through turn 9 here, and then Law just kind of recognizes that there's no way that they can possibly gain an advantage on this map if they start as player 2 in a mirror match. And even if it's not a mirror match, that non-mirror match will also get min-maxed to some point, a bit differently, and it might have a bit of a different win ratio, but it will reach equilibrium with player 2 playing at a disadvantage. That's just the nature of turn-based strategy games. So what's funny is when you get two people at the highest ratings playing maps, it probably takes about a dozen matches for people to come to this conclusion here. That Law recognizes, and you can read this yourself, Law recognizes that this map is pretty imbalanced. There's a TA line for player 1, and if they play that line to the center of the map and then they min-max the stalling phase, then player 2 just has no chance. And the funny thing here is that J-Town is just laughing about it because they can't disagree. So what happens in the highest rated matches is that if you're playing as the disadvantaged player, the only fair outcome is to request a draw from your opponent. So from the player 1 advantage here, like J-Town, if there's any opponent who doesn't recognize this disadvantaged state, then it's a free win for J-Town. So I think what goes on at the highest levels in this community is that the way you maintain the highest MMR is by drawing with an opponent who can't disagree with your conclusion that the naturally disadvantaged player has no chance. Because that is the natural outcome, especially in full vision maps. That outcome is inevitable, and the highest rated players will solve this within like 20 matches on pretty much any map. And yeah, so that's that. So I pose that there's a thing that you can include to map design that doesn't solve this problem, but it increases the obscurity of a map by a lot. I don't know how much. I would imagine like maybe 5 times or tenfold or something, whatever that means. So the element that I'm talking about here is developing the development phase when you're designing a map around Fog of War, so that there's not just one inevitable build order that players do every single time. Because if Law does anything different than this build order that they've done here, it will result in J-Town just winning. It will. So I'll show you what I'm talking about with Fog of War. Is that in theory, on this map, is that player 2 is naturally disadvantaged. And that's because player 1 gets to move first. And for other reasons that I'll not go into too much depth here. But in theory, player 2 is disadvantaged. And so the way that I combat that disadvantage newly is including the 2 base 1 infantry here, which works magnificently, by the way. It makes this map even better. Now that I'm at this point, I'm willing to incorporate it. And so on this map, what happens is player 2 has the recon rush advantage that player 1 cannot do. And this recon rush advantage is an option that player 2 can commit to if they want to, where the recon provides information that player 1 is naturally disadvantaged. So player 1, part of the turn advantage is that player 1 is in the darkness and player 2 can kind of see what's coming up next from their opponent. But player 1 is so naturally strongly advantaged because they have that first strike capability that it kind of plays off. It helps into that turn advantage balance a bit more. And so when you design a map with the idea that player 2 is naturally disadvantaged, and so we give them that vision advantage, then they can do a variety of build orders that you naturally couldn't do if full vision were enabled on this map. So if full vision were enabled on this map, then player 1 knows and reacts to what player 2 is going to do. So for example, in this replay here, player 2 does the recon rush, which because it's Fog of War, player 1 doesn't know that this is happening. And so player 1 has to play a bit more of a standard opener, which is very strong, which is the recon rush opener, or the recon defense opener. If player 1 commits to this build order and player 2 doesn't do the recon rush, then it still plays fairly for player 1 if they send that recon rush to then rush their opponent. So there's a really interesting dynamic that goes on here with respect to what player 1 can see from their player 2 opponent, which enables player 2 to do a different variety of openers that player 1 normally would counter because they had full vision. So this is a really complicated thing to elaborate to people. That is, it's much more simple to explain the dynamic that goes on with full vision, because it's just nicer to be able to see what your opponent is doing. But unfortunately, that dynamic inevitably leads into min-maxing the development phase very quickly, and then min-maxing the stalling phase after you figure out what the min-maxing development phase is. And then a map gets set in stone over the course of like a month between a group of high-rated players. So funny thing, on this website, the perfect MMR level that you want to be, where you'll have the most fun on this website, is between like 1100 to like 1300 MMR, where during the development phase, you kind of make a few mistakes, and so does your opponent. And that increases the variety of complexity a lot, because it's not set in stone. So I do believe that there's probably a decent amount of animosity that grows amongst the highest rated players, because if you're a high rated player on this website, you recognize that this game is quite easy to solve, and that maps basically just get rotated in and out of the map pool because people remember how to solve these maps by memory, because that's just how this game goes when it's played. Especially in full vision, you have to do the same thing every single time, else you put yourself at a disadvantage. So yeah, so I think that's what goes on with this game on the whole, this genre, is that we need to include Fog of War and this element that I've included that increases the diversity of map openers and the things that player one will have to look out from their opponent who is playing at a natural disadvantage to them, in theory. So it could be such that this 2 base 1 infantry opener is advantage for player 2, but games played and on aggregate we could figure it out, and then we could possibly balance something to make it a bit better. So anyways, yeah, this game is min-maxed, especially when Fog of War is disabled. If you're playing full vision, it's much easier to solve a map than it is to solve a map if you play with Fog of War on, where there's different varieties of openers that the naturally advantaged player has to look out for. Okay, so that's what I have to say about that. Maybe you guys can relate. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys. If you like this video, if you want to make maps with this Fog of War element included, where there's a diversity of openers, then you can join the Discord and we can talk about that method that I've developed over the past 2 years. So yeah, come join the Discord and we'll make some fun maps. Okay, adios.